30 minutes on receiving witnesses with respect to proposed legislation C-29. We have with us this afternoon for the first half hour, and they will stay on for the hour when the minister will join them. We have Mr. Andy Garrow, Director, Policy and Strategic Direction, Reconciliation Secretariat, Planning and Partnerships. Ms. Kate Ledgerwood, Director General, Policy and Strategic Direction, also from Reconciliation Secretariat, and Ms. Sital Sunga, Senior Counsel from the Deputy Department of Justice. So to ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline the usual rules. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services in English, French, and Inuktitut are available for the first part of today's meeting. Please be patient with the interpretation. There may be a delay. For those in the video conference, the interpretation button is found at the bottom of your screen. It's the interpretation globe, and you can listen in either English or French, or in Inuktitut, if you choose. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately, and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored. Before we continue, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. And those in the room, of course, your microphone is controlled by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. Please, when speaking, speak slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, please put your mic in mute. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So we're going to launch immediately into questions. We'll have 6 minutes for each of the 4 parties. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe, Mr. Vidal, you will be starting with as first speaker for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, folks, for being here today. And I think if I recall, most of you were on the technical briefing the other night, if I can remember the faces in the checkerboard instead of here in person. So appreciate that the other night as well. I just want to go through a little bit of timing, and I want you to help me out with a couple things just to make sure I understand. If I'm clear, the government announced the creation of an interim board of directors in December of 2017. That was through a governor and council appointment, which would be directed by cabinet. This interim board that was appointed at that time had issued a final report. So they did their work and issued a final report to the then minister on June 12th of 2018 with 20 fairly specific recommendations. And in the technical briefing from the other night, you indicated that these recommendations were the basis for the draft legal framework, which ultimately ended up in Bill C-29 now. It appears that the majority of the work, or the vast majority of the work, was already done by June of 2018 to kind of create this council. That was when the work happened. But not until December of 2021 did the minister actually take that next step as advised by the interim board and their report to appoint the transitional committee members. And then finally, in March of 2022, the final recommendations of that group were given back to the minister to go ahead and finalize the legislation. My first question is just simply, is that an accurate time frame? That have I got that understood well?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. So could you tell me why or what happened between June of 2018 and December of 2021? Why was, my understanding is there was nothing done in that 3.5-year period to advance this process. Can you tell me why or why not that was the case?
So in that period of time, the department undertook its analysis of the recommendations that were provided by the interim board and provided that analysis to the government and really did a thorough review of what was provided, because the interim board in that period of time did extensive engagement with their work and came up with really sound recommendations in terms of where this should move forward. So that analysis took some time, and also in terms of what were the next steps. There was the recommendation for establishing a transitional committee, so determining the process for that, and then in the meantime, that's when the pandemic came as well, and that delayed efforts significantly, as well as identifying who was going to be on the transitional committee. So there were some delays in that process.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, but sorry, we use COVID as an excuse, or the pandemic as an excuse, but the time frame was June 18. The pandemic didn't start till March of 2020. That's 18 months, almost 2 years in the meantime, and really the next steps that were already identified by the report on June the 12th of 2018 indicated the next step was to appoint the transitional committee. So I'm not quite following, all this work that was supposedly done in the 3.5 years. It seems to me, and from your technical briefing, honestly, in the presentation, it seemed pretty clear that things just paused and then picked up again in December of 2021. So I will leave that one for now, and I'll move on to something different, because I think my assumptions on that seem to be fairly accurate. Call to action 56. We've had this conversation a couple times over the last few weeks already. Call to action 56 explicitly calls on the Prime Minister to answer the National Council for Reconciliation's annual report by providing a response. This interim board of directors that issued these 20 recommendations back in June of 2018 also advised that that should be the process, but yet according to the bill, it's the minister that would respond to the National Council's annual report. Can you tell me how and who made the decision to not respect that call to action, have the minister respond instead of the Prime Minister?
For that one, thank you for the question too. So in that one, the minister was bringing forward the legislation, and in that process, it was determined that the minister responsible for the legislation would be the appropriate person to table the responses as identified in the legislation.
So the minister made that decision on his own. That wasn't something recommended by any of the transitional committee people or department officials?
That came out through the drafting of the legislation process. Yeah.
So from the minister?
Through the process, yes.
Thank you. In the legislation, there's some language that I struggle with. I'm going to be quick because I think I'm running out of time, Mr. Chair, right? There's some language in the purpose that talks about the purpose of this bill is to advance efforts for reconciliation. Sorry, I'm an accountant. I'm all about measurable outcomes and numbers and data and that kind of thing. I'm going, can you give me any indication of if there's been discussions at all in this journey of 4.5 years about how we would measure the success of advancing efforts for reconciliation?
Thank you very much for the question. Perhaps I'll say that, and as we have been developing this and working very closely with the Transitional Committee, one of the directions that we have received is very much to provide the frame, but let the board make some of these determinations once it's formed. It is there that it can make the determination in the future on the scope. I think it is better placed than perhaps ourselves to determine what is to be advanced around reconciliation. So while this bill is there to provide the frame, we understand and appreciate that there will be much more work once the board is in place.
I appreciate that, but the legislation says advance efforts, and I think it could really actually just say advance reconciliation. Like, we want to actually move forward on advancing reconciliation. I don't think we can measure efforts in this context. So, and I think we heard that from the Transitional Committee and the interim board of directors, some of the people on those that said this language was pretty weak. So that's kind of somewhere we'll be going in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll now go to Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that we did just have the second National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I want to just acknowledge survivors and descendants from my riding, of course, across Atlantic Canada and throughout the nation. I was fortunate enough to attend a ceremony. There was anticipated 50 people, and it was hundreds of people, and I think that speaks to the important work that's being undertaken and how effective it is at communicating just how critical it is for all of us to walk this road of reconciliation. I want to point to that there have been several organizations and self-governing First Nations who have voiced concerns about perhaps a lack of consultation for the legislation in the National Council. They might feel left out of the process. So could you please elaborate on the consultation process that the interim board undertook to advise on what the National Council for Reconciliation would look like and just how important it is to include Indigenous voices at every step of the way? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so in the process and we're looking at this in terms of what's happened over the years from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to now. So in that process, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they traveled across the country with the national events, with the community events and the regional events that were part of that process, and heard from thousands of survivors, thousands of community members and those impacted by residential schools. So that was one thing, and that created the framework of what went into Call to Action 53, which is what's been established for the National Council on Reconciliation. After that, the interim board, they also held engagement. So they established a public website for any interested individual could across Canada could share their thoughts on the National Council for Reconciliation. They did some outreach to the national Indigenous organizations, and then they also hosted an event where a number of experts came in. And then with the transitional committee, noting that, it was time for the legislation to be moving forward, they wanted to move this forward as quickly as possible. They also did some engagement as well, but with targeted experts on the framework of legislation and what would be in there.
Would either of you like to add anything to that? Okay, great. And I mean, were there any lessons learned throughout that process that you could maybe speak to that might be helpful for our committee?
So in this process, I mean, this is a really broad council that we're establishing. There's a number of people that are going to be impacted by it. But I think over time, and we're seeing this in a number of areas, but it's the level of engagement that's happening across the country on issues is there's a lot happening because of that. But I think what's happened here is, we're grateful for the experts that came and brought their voices to the table. We're grateful for the leadership that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has shown, and the interim board members and the transitional committee members, because I think, what they've done is created a solid framework and that we see in the legislation today.
Could you speak also kind of more broadly into what the Reconciliation Secretariat does? Just curious and excited to learn more about it.
Very much for the question, Chair. So the Reconciliation Secretariat, which is situated within Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, supports what is called the permanent bilateral mechanisms. So these are meetings that take place between Indigenous partners, the three national Indigenous organizations, annually. There is meetings that take place with the Prime Minister as well with other ministers, but really that is a forum to advance joint policy initiatives. So it's a place that we can come together to the table, identify key issues and policies, and really work and take efforts to make some differences and move programs forward. As well as my colleague Andy Garrow, he helps support both the overarching whole of government approach to calls to action, as well he is supporting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the advancement of this bill too.
Excellent. I would just add that oftentimes the communication piece is sometimes difficult. So I talked a little bit about those who might have felt left out of the process. I've also seen a bit of feedback even from Canadians, even around the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, just not understanding kind of where it's grounded in, that it's actually a response to a call to action itself. So can you speak to just maybe the communications piece and what it looks like to engage with community members across the country?
Sure. So thank you for the question. So a lot of this is just, talking about the different aspects or what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation report, and also in terms of what the interim board and the council and the transitional committee have heard through their journeys. And so that communication has gone out as well. We've tried to share some information through the website and through minister statements, etc., about it as well.
That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Atwood. Nous irons maintenant à Madame Gill.
The floor is now to Ms. Gill. 6 minutes, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. I have questions also about prior consultation prior to the drafting of the bill. You mentioned a few times that many, many people have been consulted, engaged. We've heard figures, well, not so much figures, but we hear that many. So I'd like to know how many First Nations on Canadian land, and of course it's their land as well, were they all consulted?
Through the processes that were available, there was opportunities for all First Nations and all individual everybody in Canada to participate in the process, especially through the open website that was posted.
Ce serait pas ma question.
That's not quite what I meant. I mean, who participated? Not who, but were they all called on to participate? Were they all engaged? Were they all able to share their opinions across all nations? Thank you for the question. I don't think we have that information at present, but it's something that we can check for. Thank you very much. And if it's possible, I imagine if you don't have that information, I'd also like to know whether there are any reasons for which people participated. Several communities are remote, don't necessarily have the means, including technological means, to participate. I think, Mr. Garrow, you brought up the existence of Internet, and some don't have Internet access, or else they're not Internet literate, or they don't have the infrastructures to acquire that literacy. So there is that theoretical possibility they could get involved, but were they practically able, in reality, able to participate? That might be useful to know. I mean, consultation has to, really reach people. People have to be able to be consulted, in a position to be consulted. So that would be my first question. I have another question as well about the way the council has been incorporated and created, both the transitional committee, or the interim board rather, over 5 years, and what its mandate is. I'd like to know who suggested the composition of the transitional committee and the interim board.
So in terms of developing the transitional committee, that was developed by the department in consultation with the minister's office, and the appointments were made by the minister.
D'accord. Donc, ce ne sont
Very well. So these were not people put forward by First Nations interested parties or themselves. It was really the department that suggested who should make up these groups, if I've understood that correctly. And what were the reasons for which each of these groups are being represented on, let's say, the transitional committee or the interim board? Let me give you an example. Based on what little I know and what few contacts I have with First Nations peoples, elders are highly important in communities. Of course, these are the knowledge keepers. They know the language and the traditions of their peoples. And we want to ensure that all the calls for action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are respected. So the first people who might see to this are the elders, yet they are not represented on the committee. So I'm wondering why or how the choice of 9 administrators was arrived at, and why elders are excluded from that group of 9.
Thank you for the question. And Mr. Chair, if I could just offer one clarification too, that the interim board and the transitional committee were appointments by the minister with different memberships as well. The 9 members, the 9 to 13 members, are members that will be appointed for the council once it is established, or they will be named, and then they'll go through the incorporation process, and that's how they'll be appointed. But that's the process for the 9 members. The folks that were a part of the interim board and part of the transitional committee, they were selected because they bring expertise, they bring a background and knowledge, and they were from a wide range of people across Canada. There was Chief Wilton Littlechild there, who's a survivor, who's well known, who's been leading a lot of the conversation on this for 15 years. There's other folks like Edith Cloutier, who's
En fait, j'ai vraiment pas beaucoup de temps, mais c'est vraiment.
So sorry, I'm going to run out of time. So it was merit-based appointments, if I understand correctly. All right. One last question then, but I think I'll keep it for the second round. 25 seconds, all right. You spoke of merit. Perhaps you might define what merit is, because once again, I know that that would be from the government's point of view for this transitional committee. We certainly hope that it would be the First Nations being called on to make appointments to the board, to appoint the members of the board. And so I'm wondering how you would define the merit needed to be a member.
So when they look to establish the first board, there will be an appointment. But the intention is fully that board will make the determinations in the future of how other members will be selected. They will make the determination of how to ensure representation, to ensure. So, yes, it will be up to the board to make those determinations.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons...
Thank you very much. We will now cede the floor to Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Please feel welcome. For you had made us understand many of the things about this Bill C-29 before it was established. The accountability is very important. Us Aboriginal people, Indigenous people have been expecting this for reconciliation. There's many of us who are Indigenous, our rights have been broken and not being protected. So my question is, the legislature you're requesting, is there any protection to the Aboriginal Indigenous rights?
Yes, thank you for your question. And I think that this bill will speak to that in terms of the two measures that are in there, one for the council that will prepare an annual report and on how it views reconciliation as being implemented across the country, including the implementation of the 94 calls to action, but not just on the 94 calls to action. We've heard from the Transitional Committee and the Interim Board that they want to see what's happening across the country in a number of ways that is promoting reconciliation, and we'll be commenting on that. And then there is also the requirement for the Government of Canada to issue the State of Indigenous Peoples report in response to that, and that is also a part of I'm missing the word you said, but the accountability mechanisms that are in place to ensure that there is a response and that the Government of Canada is being held accountable for reconciliation. There's also built into the legislation is the requirement to develop an information sharing protocol with the council, so that the areas of information that are in data that are outlined in the call to action and other information that the council is required in order to do its job, they'll have that ability. And that also speaks to a little bit outside of, any organization can ask for information through the Access to Information Act, but it's designed so that there's an easier mechanism or a different mechanism for the council to get information from the Government of Canada to do its job.
These are rights. For example, Indigenous language should be protected. Lack of housing issue need to be dealt with. This are also our rights, and our own self-governance for self-determination is also our right. So these just three I mentioned, but there are a lot more issues. The bodies. How can the bodies push if they break our rights? How can you enforce anything when our rights are broken?
I'll ask the question, and can I take that? I think she misunderstood my question.
Translator?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead in English.
So my question is not that I'm asking the government to enforce Indigenous rights like language, housing, and self-determination, but how would this council monitor and measure the protection of our rights, such as what I've listed?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that, as we've mentioned, so for the Bill C-29, it's to provide the frame for establishing the council. And I think one of the messages that perhaps we'll say we've heard quite clearly through the Transitional Committee and the Interim Board was very much create the frame, but let the board, the council, once it's established, determine what its roles, responsibilities, functions, all of that will be it's really, as we mentioned, it's supposed to be an arm's length independent organization. So for that reason, there's things that we can't predict, or we wouldn't want to suggest that we would know how they will set these things up. But the intention was always that the legislation creates that frame and the guidance so that the council can do the work in the future. So your question is it's a great question. It's something that it's difficult for us to answer now because we wouldn't want to suggest that we would know in advance what the council, once it's established, would look to do in terms of its work. As Andy mentioned, there will be annual reports that will be coming. The council will have the range of what it would like to report on, and the government will be required to respond to the report that they provide to us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. I suggest we suspend. We're going to receive the minister momentarily, and there isn't time to start another round. And so, if I may just ask you to be patient, we're waiting for the minister, and then we'll have an hour with the minister and the witnesses who are already with us. Thank you. Now resume. Welcome, Minister. As you know, we have begun, as of today, our study in committee of Bill C-29, and we welcome you to the committee. The officials surrounding you have answered questions for the past half hour, and we will continue now with you. And if you would like to make an opening statement, please do so. Try to keep it for 5 minutes, and then we'll proceed to questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and just please cut me off if I drag on. Kwekwe Ulukut, Tanse, hello, bonjour. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais reconnaître.
I would like to acknowledge before I begin that Canada's Parliament is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Inviting me to appear today to speak about Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. Look forward to answering these questions because strengthening this bill and ensuring that we move forward on this is a priority of all of us. Le 30 septembre, donc.
On the 30th of December, last Friday then, we marked the second National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians across the country came together in their orange shirts to acknowledge and continue to learn about the legacy of the residential schools and the international impacts on Indigenous peoples. But beyond the orange shirts, which will not suffice, there's still a lot of work to do. We need to make tangible progress on reconciliation. As the committee knows, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report and calls to action 7 years ago. Among those calls to action was number 53, which called on the Parliament of Canada to establish a National Council for Reconciliation, and calls to action 54, 55, and 56, which expanded on the roles, responsibilities, and expectations for the Council and various levels of government. Essentially, these calls to action are saying that as a country, we need to measure our progress on reconciliation. We need to be held accountable for our promises to Indigenous peoples.
The calls to action, as they are envisioned by the TRC, it's important that the board of the National Council for Reconciliation be diverse and reflective of all Indigenous peoples of Canada. If the bill is passed, I, as Minister of Crown Relations, would collaborate with the Transitional Committee to appoint the first board of directors. The first council would then establish a process to nominate and elect future board directors in accordance with the legislation as stipulated in the bill. The board would be comprised of 9 to 13 directors, at least 2/3 of whom are Indigenous. 3 directors must be nominated by the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit, Tapiriit, Kanatami, and the Métis National Council, respectively. These criteria would apply to the first board as well as the future board once the council is incorporated. Le Conseil comprend notamment.
Over time, the board would include representation from First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Indigenous organizations, youth, women, men, gender-diverse persons, and various regions in Canada, including urban, rural, and remote regions. Mr. Chair, it's important to understand that the government does not own or dictate this process. This is a collaboration, and it has been since the very beginning, as this bill was co-developed with Indigenous peoples. Indeed, Indigenous peoples lead the interim board and the transitional committee, and they have provided independent advice and recommendations that were instrumental in shaping Bill C-29.
The decision to set up the council as a not-for-profit entity, incorporating the National Council for Reconciliation as a not-for-profit organization under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act utilizes the existing legislation to set up the council. Moreover, it establishes and enables the council to be incorporated as a legal entity that operates completely independently from the Government of Canada. It'll give the council legal status under the Act and will allow the council to, for example, freely enter into contracts, have bank accounts. The council will also be able to independently fundraise for projects and future work. Important to note that Budget 2019 announced a total of $126.5 million in funding for the National Council for Reconciliation, which includes $1.5 million to support the first year of operation. The funding can be used by the board to establish their endowment for the future work, which was very important to the interim board. Je suis reconnaissant au commissaire de la Commission de.
So I recognize the works of the transitional committees, the interim board, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, survivors, the families of those survivors, all the people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who've contributed to drawing up this bill. I would be very happy to respond to any of the committee's questions. Miigwech, Kuyanemik, Marshy.
Alors, on va commencer avec la première ronde.
Thank you, Minister. So we'll start our first round of questions. Mr. Vidal, you have 6 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Minister, for coming today. Minister, you talked about the call to action number 53 and the importance of independence. I want to talk about independence for a couple of minutes. The Governor General, acting on the advice of Cabinet, appointed the interim board back in 2018. They did 6 months of work, came up with a final report. Then there was a long delay. You appointed the Transition Committee in December 21. And then, as you stated in your comments, that you, the Minister, in collaboration with the Transition Committee, which you appointed, will select the first board of directors. You'll take their advice. This first board of directors is then to establish an application process for future boards members to be elected by a yet undefined membership. We don't know who that membership will be yet, according to the, I mean, I get the nonprofit organization. There's no articles of incorporation yet. I get all that. In your own words, when talking about this body, you say it isn't up to Canada to be grading itself, but yet when I look at this process, Minister, I have to be honest that I have to ask you why you're comfortable with either actually having so much direct control or influence over this body that's going to be tasked with holding your government to account and advancing reconciliation. And even if you don't feel that you actually have that direct control, the perception sure seems like you do.
And MP Vidal, it's a very, very fair question. And, you know, as you look through the formation of the board, this is something that will be done with the committee. Ultimately, I consider the nomination of the first board a legal artifice. It's something that, you know, as it's written in black and white, that it is with the committee itself. The work is being done. I don't see my role as being one of that is to veto people. Indeed, in the appointment of the current committee right now, essentially, I could have a call on it, but I haven't, and they have determined themselves their membership. After that, it's the Not-for-Profit Act that prevails, and they will determine their own way of reproducing what is in the act. But there's a sort of a legal construct in there that we have to get over as part of the first hurdle, and that's one that has to involve consultation. I'm open to getting recommendations that you have,
that's fair.
Because I do recognize the perception involved.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. I have such limited time, and I have a lot of questions. Okay. I get what you're saying, and I get what you're implying, that you wouldn't override that. But the Act clearly says selected by the minister. That is the language of the actual bill. So, you know, in all fairness, the relationship with Indigenous people is one that probably lacks trust, and for good reason. There's lots of history for that to happen. So. I guess I'm concerned that you know, the government, with some of the record of the government, I mean, we could talk about all kinds of people, and I'm not going to go into specifics, but, you know, you're saying kind of trust me that I won't put any undue pressure, I won't influence the process, but the Act actually says you have control. So I guess you also opened the door to my next question would be, would you be willing to give up that control to alleviate the concerns of Indigenous people who have lost that trust? Is there would you sit down at the table with us and come up with a way that maybe we could actually ensure that it is Indigenous people, Indigenous organizations that not only appoint the future boards after 5 years, but actually are part of appointing that first board, which is going to set the playing field and the ground rules for all future election of the boards?
I don't want to diminish your point, MP Vidal. I'm open to recommendations of what this committee would suggest, the vast majority of whom are not Indigenous. So I don't want to reproduce the same artifice that you're criticizing this bill as having. Indeed, if you extend it to the whole parliamentary process, you have another set of arguments that feed into the initial criticism. So at one point, someone has to take a decision. I would highlight that it is an absolute discretion of the minister. It does say that it is done in collaboration with the transitional committee. But again, I'm open to recommendations of the committee as it considers other witnesses.
Thank you for that. You also talked in your comments about this legislation being co-drafted with Indigenous people. But yet, Wilton Littlechild, one of the members of both the interim board and the Transitional Committee is on the public record stating that, in fact, the bill was not co-drafted with Indigenous peoples. Is his criticism accurate, or what's his criticism compared to your comments in your comments today?
I haven't had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Littlechild on the matter.
Okay, well, I think that's something we could pursue. In our conversations with officials in the last half hour here before you came, I asked the question about who made the decision to change the call to action number 56 from the Prime Minister being the one responsible to report to you as Minister being responsible to report. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. And they said that, my understanding of what they said to us, that happened in the drafting of the legislation through the ministry. So I guess a further question of mine would be, are you amenable to the idea of amending that section so that it would actually be the Prime Minister who would be responsible to respond to this report and actually honor call to action 56?
I'd say first off, it's absurd to suggest that the Prime Minister hasn't held himself up to be responsible to Indigenous peoples for what we have been shone a light on in the last 7 years. That said, I'd absolutely be open to it. We'd have to examine what the recommendations of the committee ultimately are. But again, I do think what's in the legislation, in my mind, from a sheerly technical perspective, is more responsive in terms of a government response than what is contained in the call to action. But again, we're open to any suggestions that you would propose.
In fairness, Minister, that is not what the call to action called for, though. That's my challenge, right? So, yeah.
That's my point. I think we're trying to present a government response, and what's in the call to action is a response by the Prime Minister. But if you look at the machinery of government, a tabling in Parliament on behalf of the government is a much broader statement. But for the symbolic value of having the Prime Minister say it, I'm open to suggestions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll now go to Mr. MacLeod. Mr. MacLeod, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to the Minister. It's certainly good to see you join us here today. And it's also very good to see that the government is working with Indigenous people rather than against them, as we've seen so many times in our history. Mr. Minister, I think you know that the Northwest Territories has been dealing with a lot of challenges, very serious challenges. A recent report found that 1 in 5 homes in the Territories was in need of major repairs, and in some communities is up to 60%. The people in Fort Good Hope are dealing with the aftermath of multiple stabbings last month that left 1 resident dead. And just this past week, the chief coroner released new data showing that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of suicides this year in the Beaufort Delta. The community of Tuktoyaktuk alone, they've seen 4 deaths in the last three months. And at the root of these problems, in my view, is the ongoing impact of colonialism and also the intergenerational trauma from the residential school system. And it's no coincidence that the Northwest Territories has the highest rate of residential school survivors per capita. So I want to ask you if you could explain how the work of the National Council for Reconciliation will ensure that Canada does the work necessary to address these issues.
Thank you, MP MacLeod, and appreciate the question. Clearly, as we all know, members of this committee know, this is an organization that is supposed to be independent from the government, and there has been a lot of back and forth, very public back and forth, as to the state of the completion of the TRC calls to action, with the government at times stating how much it has completed, and then perhaps how much is ongoing. Noting that not all the calls to actions do call on the federal government specifically to fulfill these calls, the most notable one obviously being the apology from the Pope this summer that was given. But again, it's the federal government deciding how much has been done and what needs to be done. And we know that Indigenous peoples often criticize this for the lack of clarity, process, and truth, frankly, from our government in the level and sufficiency of the calls to action and their level of completeness. So this board, in a sense, will hold this government and subsequent governments to account, particularly on issues that require persistent, sustained investments in matters like mental health and housing, all themes of the calls to action that we've made, as you know, significant investments in. But I can't sit here today and tell you that those are sufficient, nor that the results are following particularly fast. There is, and as you've seen in the north, being one of the places where the residential schools were closed last, the effects are felt in a generation that is still much younger, as well as on their children and families. So it isn't something that we have been particularly good at measuring, and therefore not very good at addressing. The $500 million plus that have been allocated for mental health in prior budget years, with another 200 most recently allocated, are important because we know the hidden pandemic behind that is followed after COVID and was very much present prior to that is huge, and it's the impacts are felt in the most severe forms of expression of mental health distress, whether that's problematic substance use or ideation and suicide. Minister Hajdu, as you know today, invested a supplementary amount of $11 million, which will affect in that form the Inuvialuit portion of the Northwest Territories. But there is work to do. It requires us being held to account, and it requires that type of organization to not only look at the TRC calls to action as a check the box operation, but really one as an ongoing undertaking that goes up to the duty of our government and the honor of the Crown.
Thank you for that. And it's good to see that there's investment happening in the north, and especially it feels especially good because for the longest time, Indigenous people had to sue the government to get anything in the budget, and it's good to see that that's changing. There's been a total of $126.5 million announced for this council. I'd like to know how that dollar figure, the $126.5 million proposed in the budget, was arrived at.
There was, and this is key to the financial independence of an organization such as this. You can create this organization, but it has no money. You essentially limit its ability to act because it can't pay for the proper expertise to analyze all the massive information that we'll be providing, as well as hire experts that deserve to be well paid for their work. The $126.5 million, and I'll defer to officials after this, was looked at as part of an essential injection of funds for the first number of years, as well as the possibility of creating an endowment to support ongoing activities. It might need more money, but it was sort of a measure that was come up to as part of the 2019 budget to make sure that this committee would have a level of independence that was financial in nature. I don't know, Andy, if you want to complement that.
No, that's correct. So, thank you, and also just wanted to reiterate that it was looked at in terms of the operations of the council and what would be required, but also giving it the flexibility to do some of that fundraising for additional operations, as well as an important part of it becoming a not-for-profit organization and being established that way. Yeah, so it's the operations and then in the initial years.
Okay, I have one more question.
It'll have to be very quick, Mr. McLeod.
Okay, I just wanted to ask the minister if he could reassure me that the Northwest Territories and all the northern jurisdictions will have representation on this board. We don't normally belong to some of the national Indigenous organizations, but we do have a large Indigenous population.
I think quickly the answer is yes, that the discretion will not be mine to wield. So we have that in the law. It's been noted many times, and there is that need to have that diverse representation. So that's the answer I can give you right now, MP McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Nous irons maintenant Madame Gill.
And we now turn the floor to Ms. Gill, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Minister for joining us here in this committee meeting. During the first round of questions, I put questions about consultations and the representation of First Nations during those consultations. And that question applies as well for the choice of the membership of the interim board. The final council, actually, the final board, not the transitional committee or the interim board. Considering the three organizations, the AFN, Inuit, Tapirit, and the Métis National Council, do they actually cover all First Nations and such Indigenous peoples across Canada? The answer is a little simple, perhaps, but it's no. A great majority of Indigenous peoples do not feel that they are represented by the AFN. That's public knowledge. What we tried to do in organizing representation was to ensure that there would be room for each group or each large group. And you may hear other witnesses speaking to how the committee membership will be composed. We wanted to avoid as well anything that would be too politicized. These are entities that don't necessarily have are necessarily right holders according to the FN. It's the communities who are rights holders. So yes, you can have well-known people who can have an independent voice on the board, but also people who are approved by AFN to some extent. So through you, Mr. Chair, my next question: are there any mechanisms foreseen to ensure that other groups or other First Nations groups, other representative groups who feel they're not represented, be represented elsewhere in another fashion? Are there other membership positions elsewhere? I'm open to recommendations. And we will have to listen to testimony from those who will be involved. It's very difficult when you have only 13 seats around the table. It's not going to be perfect. Yes, of course, we're always looking for the best possible representation, so that's why I was curious what your thoughts were, and I'm glad to hear from you that you don't expect things to be perfect, because, of course, that's usually the case. Now, another matter that you have brought up already, not everyone was able to become involved in the consultation process, you have said, and then you have there have been comments or positions taken on the membership, people who feel they will not be represented. Has that sort of percolated up to you? Have you heard that sort of thing from First Nations representatives? I hesitate to speak for First Nations or for Indigenous groups of any sort. I think you will hear such complaints to the effect that it will not be a perfect process. There are many groups and people who would like to see specific people as members appointed to the composition of the final committee. Could you give us some evaluation, some percentage perhaps? Tell us how representative the final grouping will be of Indigenous peoples across the land. I know that's sort of difficult, but I think that generally speaking, people are truly satisfied with the principle as it is provided for in C-29. When it comes right down to it, though, they would all like to be heard around the table. Not that I have any argument against people who have a very political point of view, but there's an argument to be made for the presence of people who are politicized, perhaps, but not necessarily politicians, who have a broader approach. I think that looking back on this, most people are going to be very satisfied with the final result. But of course, so we don't have a specific proportion to advance as to how people will feel about this, whether they're entirely for it or not. But yes, it will not be perfect. So I think would like to know a little bit more about the arm's length nature of the organization. Of course, right now it is being composed and created, established. So at this point, of course, there is a link to the government, which is establishing it. But eventually, much like any board, one would hope that it will be truly independent. Conflict of interest, for example. So if the government is funding certain organizations, how could we ensure that there won't be any difficulties, or how any difficulties and criticisms from this eventual board would be heard by the government, and how it would remain an independent voice? Women, youth are already benefiting from government funding. How will they be in a position to speak openly without necessarily affecting the funding they will have, and so on and so forth within this board? Well, the legislation ensures and provides for a surveillance process to ensure that not-for-profit aspects of their existence are respected, because they are being established under the Canadian Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which renders them independent. So we, therefore, the government would be criticized were it to try to influence this group. So I assume that this will help protect their independence, the fact that they are governed by this act. Thank you, Ms. Guild. We will now turn to Ms. Iglaut. 6 minutes, madam.
Thank you.
Tema.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Miller, for being here. I welcome you. With the Indigenous, those of us who are Indigenous, our rights have been broken many times and are never protected. This new legislation talked about only a couple of things about rights. I'd like you to clarify those about accountability, or the reconciliation. How would you motion or recommendation to how well you can protect the Indigenous rights?
Can I make MP Laut for that? And thank the translator for the work today. This board is a partial answer to accountability for the government generally. It responds specifically to calls to action 53 to 56 to make sure that we are being held to account as a government for the 96 calls to action. It's not the perfect mechanism of entire accountability. There are other ones, and you mentioned the rights-based approach that we must take as a government with respect to implementing not only the 96 calls to action, but the calls to justice in the final report into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. There are many moving parts across sort of the spectrum of reconciliation-related initiatives that look for accountability of the federal government and making sure that we're moving on a rights-based process. The foremost of which is still outstanding, which is the action plan into the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which will provide a pathway. This will feed into it, and indeed the references to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is referred to in the Act, but it's not the only instrument. I think it'll be it's a very long-awaited for instrument that it will be sort of the authority on whether the government is fulfilling its actions, and not only our government, but other governments at other levels. And obviously one that we can look at budgetary implementation and policy reforms if they have those recommendations and choose to do so, as well as the annual report on reconciliation that is to be tabled according to the law in Parliament. So it is one of many, but I do want to highlight your main point, which is to keep focusing on a rights-based approach to this and not sort of a transactional approach to a lot of this, which has characterized a number of initiatives across the government.
Thank you for your answer. Last year, on June 2021, there was an implementation of they have a new commissioner for Indigenous languages. One was appointed. Ronald Innes was appointed. So thinking about that, they're also diverse and different from different perspectives that they will make a recommendation, and we were expecting that. So thinking about that, how will this be diverse, or would it be similar to that type of process? When trying to think about, do you think this would be a good route to take with regards to our rights? Example, the rights to our language.
Yeah, it's a great question. I met with Commissioner Ignace this morning to speak about the work that's ongoing and the work that the Commission's doing. There's an opportunity here, I think, to cross-pollinate, and I think that it's odd to say you're limited only to language, because language is identity, and it falls into every aspect of the calls to action, as well as the work that the Commission will be doing. But the Commission's work, at least Commissioner Ignace's work, is targeted specifically as to how the work that needs to be done on Indigenous languages is still outstanding, and the recommendations that have to be made by the government are related to that particular area of language, which is obviously so key to this debate. But I do think there will be an opportunity. They shouldn't limit each other in how they approach. So, for example, I wouldn't think this Commission would abstract itself from the calls to action that deal specifically with language. They can have other views, which is their right. But I do see the opportunity to actually feed into each other and to have a better approach as we talk about something in this country that we're not very good at talking about, or at least having an intellectual debate on, which is language, and particularly in the promotion of Indigenous languages, which both colonizing languages has contributed to destroy. And that's something that is an ongoing challenge, but will be an opportunity in both the form of the Language Commissioner and this board.
Thank you. That's it. We have time for a complete second round, and so we've never done this, but we're going to start off right away. Is it Mr. Schmale this time for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister and officials, for being here today. I want to pick up the line of questioning with Madame Gill regarding representation. So we talked about the big three being included on the board of directors initially. We've had through testimony your words, who pointed out that there's a vast majority of Indigenous people who are not feeling represented by the big three. But it also says after 5 years, you get some mandated representation on the council from groups like Indigenous women, youth, that kind of thing. Why not do that right away? Help me understand that.
There are the three national Indigenous organizations have a very powerful voice in this country, and it is important for them to have that representation on the board. As I explained to MP Gill, we're open to suggestions. We want to make sure that there is a diverse representation on the board. How much the federal government actually steers that is a challenge. It's why we've deferred quite a lot to the interim board and the transitional board. But it isn't lost on me that there are perhaps some organizations that are forceful advocates of Indigenous peoples that will not feel represented necessarily, or not have, they may feel represented but not have the opportunity to appoint one of their own. This can be a highly political and politicized process. Again, I think my recommendation to this committee, if it chooses to do so, is to put forward some suggestions, understanding this has to be a working group that isn't too large, but has that level of representativity. And I would note the comments that MP McLeod made, which is that, you know, the North, despite having fewer people, has to have that representation on the board, particularly in light of his comments on residential school survivors.
Okay, because I'm sure you're aware, the Native Alliance of Quebec, the Manitoba Métis Federation, the Congress of Aboriginal People have all said that they want to be included rather than having to wait. So, just again for the record, the government is open to reasonable suggestions.
We're open to you.
Okay. Let's talk about timeframes if we can now. So, according to the technical briefing, the interim board of directors did 6 months of work between January to June of 2018. Then the transitional committee did 3 months of work between January and March of 2022. There's a massive gap there. What happened to that first bit of work that was done way before the pandemic, starting in 2018, and how did we get to the point we are now where there's been a long time coming for any movement?
I don't want to blame the entirety of this on the pandemic. There is a large measure of that is attributable to the pandemic. You know, recall that for that 2-year period, the focus of particularly Indigenous communities was to keep their own alive and safe, which is a basic minimum, but it became priority number one under the pandemic.
December of 2020, like the pandemic didn't start until, what, March of 2020, when the world declared a health emergency.
Like I said, I'm not going to ascribe everything to the pandemic, but for a large measure of this, and recall that the funding for this, it's not like nothing happened. The funding was achieved in budget 2019, so it's not an accurate argument to say that nothing was happened. There has been work that's been done.
I just want to know what, like in terms of.
Well,
it took a long time to get this going here. Like this has been a lot of years.
Isn't nothing, and I would add that just to complete my thought, the large portion of that time period relates to a period of, let's hope, a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic where people were focused on keeping their own alive.
Absolutely, and no one is debating the fact that, you know, everyone around the world had their priorities changed during the pandemic. What I'm trying to focus on, what was happening way before that for 2 years, and all of a sudden there's a rush for it at the end, right? We have to get this tabled now. We've had years, minus the pandemic, to get moving on this, and all of a sudden now's the crush to get this done ASAP. I agree, it's important. But what has been, like, I'm still not understanding what has been the blockages here.
Well, I would submit to you that in the light of the discoveries in and around Kamloops, our government has been focused on how we do accelerate things, and despite the work of the transitional committee and the interim
during the
board.
Pandemic as well. Again, we're going before the pandemic.
Sure. If you want me to isolate a period of time that is a few months, I can't offer you an explanation that obviously will satisfy you. But again,
months, I'm saying a few years, like 2018.
Sorry, just recall the time frame that we're talking about.
For 2018. So the board of directors, they started their work in January of 2018. That started from January to June of 2018. Okay. Then the transitional committee did an additional 3 months of work after that. So you've had all this information, all this work. We're still in 2018. Pandemic hit in 2020. I'm just curious what happened from 2018 to March of 2020.
Well, we got $126 million to get it happened, and then there was also a pandemic, so I wouldn't suggest that that's nothing. The fact of the matter, this is before us here today. We've been told by Indigenous people across the country that we need to accelerate things, particularly in and around the discoveries by Mark Graves' residential schools, and we've been moving quickly. This is a bill that was been put in front of you in June. and it's something that we'd like to get done, and it's the priority of our government. I think it should be a priority of every MP.
It is. We're being
Thank you,
asked.
thank you, Mr. Schmale. We'll go to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you also to the Minister and officials for being here today. Minister, one of the key functions of the Council is going to be reporting on the progress on reconciliation, as well as offering recommendations to advance it. And it's really critical that the Council has access to documents, data, and reports from the government so that they can to effectively be able to do their work and report. And actually, Call to Action 55 calls on the federal government to disclose documents to the Council. I was hoping you could elaborate on what this process will look like according to Section 16 and how it can ensure that the Council will have access to all of the information that it's needed to inform their work.
That's an excellent question, and it's something that that we'll have to make sure we're putting our best foot forward in providing the documentation that the board asks us to provide. It is it's key to us that there's a fluid back and forth in how and what we provide to the board members as they request information. That goes through a process of establishing a protocol and constant lines of communication. So information requests don't get lost. Any suggestions, frankly, that this committee would have in strengthening the mechanisms that have been proposed inside the proposed bill would be very much welcomed by us. One of the key aspects to this is measuring things, and you can't measure things that you can't ascertain or have the information to back up your conclusions. So this, in my mind, the results and the recommendations that will be made by this independent board hinge on their ability to operate on their own and their ability to have access to documentation from the government in a timely fashion across various ministries. As you would know, the TRC calls ask on the entirety of government to deliver, and it isn't limited to one or two departments that touch and concern Indigenous peoples. It touches on all departments. So that'll be, I anticipate that being a challenge, but it's a challenge that we can live up to if we have robust legislation that gets the government to do what it's supposed to do.
Thank you for that. And I think that is really important, just to make sure that there isn't going to be any information that the Council will be asking for that will be blocked coming from our government and all future governments. But certainly just as important as providing the information to do their work is the significance of having the government have to respond to that. And that's what Section 17.3 directs or addresses directly. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, what recourse will there be if the government response is deemed to be insufficient or lacking in the information that appropriately responds to the requests made by the Council?
The ability of the Council in the face of a government request that is insufficient. I think you've seen proof of that, particularly in this very important aspect of our future and our present. Obviously, being a government in minority, there is the ability to use a level of recourse that has really drastic consequences if people are truly seized by how important it is to answer these recommendations by the committee. Certainly, folks around the table will probably know the power that they have to compel the government to do things in that type of situation, but also this is to inform not only government to get on with it, but also to have society focused on it. So we get a lot of pressure from constituents, from Indigenous leadership, to get moving on things when things are brought to light, and I believe we're up to the task to the extent we haven't been so up to now. So this is an added layer of credibility. It's an added layer of moral authority and imperative for us to move when we're found to be lacking in these areas. So I think it's quite forceful. I don't know what the process would be if if the government's response doesn't fall short of the legislation, there's always a judicial process, but I think the repercussions are quite severe when constituents make sure that their elected representatives are living up to their expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. We'll now go on ira à Madame Gill pour 2 minutes.
And now the floor is Ms. Gill's 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps one last question then regarding the broad mandate. Of course, understandably, that's necessary, but it is extremely broad. The matter of overseeing the progress on reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, and the reports that must be tabled to promote, favor, and so on and so forth in all sectors of Canadian societies and at all levels of government. Could you tell us what you mean by across all sectors of Canadian society? That certainly seems to be everything. Same for levels of government. Municipal as well? Is that intended? Indigenous levels of government? So both the social and the government levels, what's at issue? That's the intention, certainly, of that clause. And, of course, the committee will be free to decide how to use this, deciding what levels of government will be called on and what their point of view will focus on when it comes to what is or is not working. We know that 2/3 of the calls to action speak to the federal government, others, universities, provincial governments, municipal orders of government. We know that there's an entire chapter addressing issues in Quebec. But it will be free to the group to decide, and they will decide what emphasis to put on what sectors and orders of government. But it certainly gives them a freedom to move, a broad perspective to work within. So, yes, literally then, indeed that it is all levels and all sectors. As for funding, if the mandate is this broad, I know that we've heard a concern about multi-year funding for the commission also was an issue. How will it work? That's the analysis that we carried out, that this would suffice for the first years and that they would then be able to invest, to raise funds. Of course, this will be a not-for-profit corporation. $126 million, though, is a considerable sum for an organization of its size. They will have work to do, though. They will need to provide for the salaries of those they will hire. We know that they will surely ask for more funding. That will be addressed when it comes down the pipeline.
Thank you. This independent board, I know it will have directors from Indigenous people, while not Indigenous governing nation. How do you see the Crown's relationship to and impact with the Crown's relationship to Indigenous nations being impacted when the Indigenous organizations should be working with the Inuit or the Indigenous organizations?
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly, it's a good one, because I think a lot of the times the tendency has been to say we're going to create something and then wash our hands of it, and then that satisfies the obligation that we have, that the Crown has towards the particular Indigenous group, and each has its specific relationship that is historical and present in nature. The Inuit Crown partnership obviously being top of mind, but the treaty relationships as well, and they're all nuanced. And so this commission, I think, heightens it. I think it enhances it. I think it enhances it for not only the civil servants that don't spend their days doing this, but have a responsibility to live up. And that's why we have the Inuit Crown Nunangat policy that is key to perfecting that relationship. But I use that as an example because it is something that we've worked on for a very long time, and the proof is still outstanding to see whether it is actually working. But it is something I think we need to remind ourselves, because far too often Indigenous groups come to the table having to educate us on our relationship, as opposed to it should be a no-brainer that we have that relationship and we should be educated ourselves as to what it is. So I think I'm not creating a false tension in the question that you asked, but I think it can actually enhance. I think it can actually enhance the relationships that are nuanced and diverse in nature, not only directly towards Indigenous peoples, but with the rights holders themselves, to the extent they hold collective rights and represent them. And I think that is varied, and having a group of people that is independent that can express that will not only reinforce it, but it is also a reminder that we can't simply say the Commission has spoken and we can ignore all the other things that are going on that are used to hold us to account, or at least the relationships that we have. This is about human dynamics and political dynamics. They're not perfect, but I think this will be an added benefit if we act like the mature, responsibility government that we hold ourselves out to be.
Thank you, Mr. Laut. Nous irons maintenant Monsieur Deltel.
And now I recognize Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Chair. Of course, I congratulate you on what you accomplished 28 years ago, and thank you to being with us, witnesses. Good day, Mr. Minister. And we've always been able to work well together, so I thank you in public here. I have the privilege of representing the community of Wendake, the Wendat, who have been here on ancestral territories forever, and a little more permanently in a specific spot for over 300 years. I was able to represent them for 7 years at the National Assembly of Quebec, and now for 7 years at the House of Commons. And I say this proudly, given that I was born in Loretteville, near their community. I grew up with them, and I'm very proud to represent them. But the electoral boundaries are such that in the next election, if I'm elected, I won't be representing them. This is a very unhappy situation for me, but we're not the ones who draw up the election geography borders. That's a demographic issue. Let me go back to the comments about different levels of government. We know that in Quebec, we have a Minister of First Nations. I'm not sure exactly what it's called. It's a ministry in Quebec, but I think the minister has been working well over the last while. And I'd like to know what the federal government wishes to accomplish with this committee, given that we want everyone to work well together, hand in hand, of course, and not the sort of thing you can argue with, motherhood and apple pie. But when you butt into each other's territories, too much overlap, you end up with problems. That's why I'm concerned. I'd like to know how the minister who's been overseeing this project, this C-29 project, sees this operating in future. The issues of the First Nations, the issues that are dear to the provinces. How will all this work out? A very relevant question. Let me say at the outset that one can represent people outside your riding. I know that the Wendat are people you care about, so you have full right to continue to care for them in many ways. So, in the context of Indigenous relations, jurisdiction is a poisoned word, a poisoned concept, given that the Constitution of Canada was imposed on them. They were forced to accept the borders that the Constitution of Canada enacted. Now, the back and forth between provinces has affected services to Indigenous peoples. The types of services they receive. And very often, the Indigenous people have borne the brunt of those interprovincial disagreements. So I won't get into what levels of government should be addressing Indigenous issues. We all should deal with Indigenous issues because this is a multi-level of government issue. I saw this during the pandemic. It's a thorny issue. Of course, relationships have not been properly upheld and respected. The numbered treaties, the James Bay Treaty, which is often put forward as being a very modern sort of treaty. But what Indigenous peoples will usually tell you is that, look, you manage your issues. We have a problem. We all need to work together. And that's how we've worked to ensure that we can go ahead and do something about the housing issues. For example, the provinces have to invest. Canada is, BC is investing. Everyone needs to get involved to ensure that the best interest of the child is respected. Very good to discuss the language, but the child's best interests has to be at the heart of our interventions. And this is something that's gone to the Supreme Court at this point. So it's more important in a sense than declaring victory, any single province declaring victory, or victory will depend on working together and addressing this in a broader fashion. So I have no specific response about the borders. I know it's a big issue for Indigenous people. I have a good interaction with Lafrenière, the outgoing minister of your ministry, but we all need to work together, and that applies to all provinces. Now, of course, the minister is bringing up some good points here, but it is your responsibility to lead. We're now in consultation. There are a number of points we've brought up about responsibility, for example, but federal-provincial relationships and their effect on Indigenous peoples, well, you're sort of in charge. So where will the provinces fit into this bill? This bill speaks to the responsibilities of the federal government, but not solely to the federal government's responsibility, given that the Commission will have the right to speak to the progress of any particular province. I imagine you've got Quebec in mind, but it could be Saskatchewan or any other. That will be their right. It's not a matter not of level of government, but of a social project, a social aim, and I won't blame them for wishing to speak to all Canadians. So Clause 9824 is somewhat nebulous, or 9124, sorry, is not too clear. It was always been interpreted in a very narrow fashion by the federal government. It's about Indigenous peoples, about a joint requirement to ensure that reconciliation goes forward from all levels of government, a responsibility to Indigenous peoples. Yes, we are perhaps the standard bearers of that responsibility, but on a legal level and on a moral level, it is a shared obligation. Thank you, Mr. Delten.
With Mr. Baptiste. Mr. Baptiste, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for joining us. And I really appreciate some of the comments I've heard about how we need to move forward on Indigenous rights and how we need to move forward on the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. And I can't help but think about how much further or how quickly we would have gotten to this legislation had Romeo Saganash's private members bill on DRIP hadn't been blocked by Conservative senators in 2018 and 2019, and then having them drag their feet on C-15. I think the timelines we could have gotten to this legislation a lot quicker. But I'm wondering, since we're talking about reconciliation and within the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was mentioned 7 times. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, Minister, on what you've heard from the leadership on the priority of really moving forward on DRIP as a priority during these years that you've been a minister in Indigenous Services and now as Crown Indigenous Relations.
And I often get this question as well as it ties into the calls to action, and I think as we looked at the very painful moment of the I guess rediscoveries in Kamloops and other locations, the focus moved quite rightly so to calls to action 72 through 76, which are now being extensively financed for people to do searches on their own time. It brought back a lot of painful memories and the importance of putting the truth before reconciliation so that we can be speaking quite clearly about what is going right, what is going wrong, and about our relationship. It is the one impediment and the justified mistrust towards the Canadian government that prevents us from doing things like implementing the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. That work is ongoing with the Minister of Justice that we are assisting with. But I think as Willie Littlechild said, the Declaration itself is a bunch of principles that set Indigenous peoples at the starting line. The finish line is yet to come, and I don't know what that finish line looks like. It's probably not up to me. It definitely isn't up to me to decide, but it's something that we have to keep working on with Indigenous communities as we review our laws, which are extensive in nature and regulations, and put together an action plan that reflects the contribution of Indigenous communities to what that would look like. Luckily, thanks to BC, we have some sort of, we have a path. It is not the one that we would completely copy, but it's something that I think shows us where the pitfalls are, where the positive elements are, and where we can move as a country as a leader in implementing it, especially in our jurisdiction, but also encouraging provinces to adopt UNDRIP as their own set of principles as they implement and reform their laws to make it consonant with basic inherent rights of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Minister. And within some of the work that this committee will be doing, it says on 7-C that they'll be conducting research on promising practice to advance reconciliation in all sectors, Canadian society, by all governments in Canada and at the international level. I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the promising practices that we're seeing on reconciliation that you've been able to witness in your journeys around Canada, especially in terms of education and creating awareness of what happened during the residential schools.
I'd preface my response to that by saying there still is a lot of ignorance as to the reality of residential schools, and I think if you see any sort of polling out there, there is a large ignorance as to what residential schools were and the legacy of that. And I think it's unfortunate that Indigenous peoples have to take it again on their shoulders, whether in a period of trauma, to educate people that should already know better. I take a lot of pride in seeing my own children being educated in a way that I wasn't, and I see that across the country. It's not anecdotal. It's a real groundswell, and that's nice to see. I think when you come to education reform and some of the discussions that I've had with elders, particularly those that have attended residential schools, there's a lot of hope in that, and it's to their credit because they have no reason to trust the Canadian government, but they see hope in us not reproducing the model that created residential schools in the first place. They see it in investments in education reforms, schools on reserve, or schools that are culturally appropriate. The path is long. I'm not going to say it's going to be fixed overnight, but it's something that I think there's a lot of hope out there, and hope that we won't fail. It isn't sort of it isn't blind to the realities of what is ongoing. But it's something I think that we can all be quite proud of as parliamentarians for having pushed that hard, and it really because Indigenous peoples pushed us. So I think that regardless of the form of government of the day, this is a joint project for everyone in Canada, and something that we have to keep moving forward on and make it irreversible. This is part of the process. This commission is part of the process. Very difficult to reverse a law and an organization that is fully funded to hold people to account and hold people's feet to the fire. We'll be the first government to be subject to it, but this is more than just keeping this government's feet to the fire, but any subsequent government that would purport to govern Canada.
Merci, Monsieur Baptiste.
Thank you, Mr. Baptiste. This brings our second round to an end. I would like to thank the Minister for his presence here and for his answers to our questions about Bill C-29.
Mr. Garrow and Ms. Sunga for being there and also answering some of our questions as well today as we continue to, in committee stage, looking at Bill C-29. With that, just a reminder to the committee that our next meeting is on Monday the 17th. We won't be here next week, and we'll continue our study on C-29. Thank you very much, everyone, and with that, the meeting is adjourned.